In a quiet corner of Palo Alto, California, a tragedy unfolded that would forever change the lives of a mother, daughter, and the man who was supposed to unite them in love. Emily Bates, 25 years old, was in the midst of preparing for the most exciting time of her life, her wedding to Daniel, a man she had been in a relationship with for nearly 3 years. She thought her future was secured, that happiness was within reach. But in the shadows, a dark secret was brewing. A secret that would tear her world apart, destroy her family, and lead to a brutal, violent conclusion. What appeared to be a peaceful, picture-perfect life was actually a fragile façade, hiding betrayal, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. The Bates family home, a modest 2-story house in a peaceful neighborhood, stood as a testament to years of family gatherings, holidays, and shared memories. But on the night of December 12, 2023, that home would become a crime scene, a place where trust was shattered and a life was violently taken. Emily's mother, Linda Bates, 50, had a secret. A secret she had managed to keep hidden from her daughter for months. Linda had been involved in an affair, one that would ultimately lead to a deadly confrontation. Daniel, the fiancé whom Emily trusted and loved, was not just her future husband. He was also her mother's lover. The affair between Linda and Daniel had started innocently enough. They had both suffered losses in their lives, Linda, from a difficult divorce that had left her emotionally scarred, and Daniel, from the pressures of a demanding career and a troubled past. The connection between them had seemed natural at first, a shared bond in their loneliness and mutual need for affection. But as the months went on, their relationship deepened in ways neither could have anticipated, leading to a dangerous and explosive situation. It wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated betrayal of the highest order. And Emily, the young woman who had been preparing to marry the love of her life, had no idea that the very man she was about to marry had already betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. The scene that night in the Bates home was chaotic. Emily, unaware of the tension between her fiancé and her mother, was eager to finalize wedding plans. But Linda, now deeply involved with Daniel, had begun to resent the life her daughter was about to start. A life that was supposed to be shared with the man she herself had fallen in love with. The jealousy and rage festered inside Linda, and what had begun as a secret affair quickly escalated into a dangerous, obsessive desire to take what Emily had. The tension between mother and daughter had been mounting for months. Linda was no longer just a mother to Emily. She had become something more, something darker. She began to manipulate the situation, using her position as Emily's mother to control the narrative, to influence Daniel, and ultimately to pull him further away from the woman he was supposed to marry. Daniel, too, had become increasingly conflicted. He found himself torn between his loyalty to Emily, the woman he had promised to love forever, and the powerful attraction he had for her mother. Linda had become a force he couldn't escape, and as time passed, the affair between them turned from a hidden escape into a full-blown obsession. The violent culmination of this twisted love triangle happened one fateful night, when the lives of all involved would change forever. Emily, in a desperate attempt to understand what had been happening between her mother and her fiancé, confronted them both. She had seen the cracks in the façade, the subtle changes in their behavior, the unspoken tension whenever the three of them were in the same room. Emily knew something was wrong, but she could never have anticipated the depth of the betrayal or the explosive violence that would follow. The confrontation that night was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it would bring tragedy. In a moment of rage and panic, Linda, unable to bear the truth of her daughter's accusations, and Daniel, consumed by the guilt of his actions, both turned on Emily. What began as a fight over love and loyalty turned into something much darker. Linda, desperate to hold on to her secret, to her power, made a fatal choice. And Daniel, in a moment of blind rage, joined her. What was supposed to be a family celebrating the future turned into a violent scene of murder and mayhem. By the time the authorities arrived, it was already too late. Emily Bates lay dead in the kitchen, the life she had once looked forward to now violently ripped away. The home that had once been filled with laughter and warmth was now a crime scene, one that would reveal the darkest sides of the people Emily had trusted the most. The investigation would uncover the twisted layers of manipulation, betrayal, and obsession that led to the murder of Emily Bates. It would expose the hidden secrets of a family that was, on the surface, like so many others, but beneath the surface, was anything but ordinary. And it would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The mother who had murdered her daughter's future, the fiancé who had betrayed his soon-to-be wife, and the community that would be left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy they could never have imagined. Linda Bates, at 50, is a woman who feels as though she's been left behind. Her divorce from Greg Lewis 5 years ago has carved a permanent void in her life, one she has yet to fill. After nearly 25 years of marriage, the separation hit Linda harder than she had anticipated. Despite her hopes for independence and self-empowerment, she often finds herself floundering in the aftermath of the dissolution of her family. She is emotionally fragile, finding it difficult to adapt to a life outside of the identity she built as a wife and mother. Linda's loneliness is profound, and though she appears strong to the outside world, her emotional state is in turmoil. The world has a way of moving on, and she feels forgotten, as though she no longer has a place in it. Her sense of self-worth has been buried for years, overshadowed by the demands of motherhood, and now that Emily is on the verge of starting her own life with a fiancé, Linda finds herself teetering on the edge of irrelevance. As she approaches her 50s, she feels increasingly invisible, disconnected from the world around her, struggling with the idea that she no longer fits into any narrative she once imagined for herself. Her relationship with her daughter, Emily, is complex. Linda loves Emily with all her heart. She's proud of her accomplishments and the woman Emily is becoming. But beneath the surface, there is also a simmering jealousy. Emily is young, beautiful, and brimming with the optimism of youth, about to embark on a new chapter of her life. Linda can't help but feel resentful of Emily's ability to move forward, a resentment that takes root as she watches her daughter get closer to the man Linda has become deeply entangled with herself, Daniel. Emily's increasing independence is a painful reminder of Linda's own personal shortcomings and emotional void. Linda is becoming increasingly desperate for validation, and she begins to see the young, fresh version of herself in Emily, which makes her long for the attention and affection she once had. In the quiet spaces of her life, Linda begins to make compromises, taking small steps toward filling the gap left behind by her failed marriage. But the consequences of these decisions would prove to be far darker than she could have anticipated. Emily Bates, at 25, is a bright, confident, and idealistic young woman standing on the threshold of the rest of her life. With a wedding to Daniel Roberts on the horizon, she is filled with the kind of hope only a young person about to marry can have. Emily sees her relationship with Daniel as the pinnacle of romantic success. He's charming, handsome, and seemingly perfect for her. A man who makes her feel loved and secure. She has no reason to doubt him, nor could she have possibly anticipated the shocking betrayal that was unfolding right under her nose. Emily comes from a family that, on the surface, appears loving and supportive. She has grown up with a strong bond to her mother, Linda, and although their relationship has had its moments of tension, they have always been close. Emily, like most young adults, is in the process of transitioning from dependence to independence, learning how to navigate adult relationships, finances, and the complexities of her own emotional life. As she prepares for her wedding, these growing pains are starting to create a distance between her and her mother. She's beginning to see her mother's flaws, even though she doesn't yet understand the full extent of the secrets Linda is hiding. Emily's idealism about love is tempered by her increasing awareness of the challenges relationships bring. Though she has always seen love as a perfect, fairy-tale ideal, she is beginning to recognize that relationships require hard work, compromise, and, most troublingly, vulnerability. Her awareness of emotional intimacy is growing, but she's unaware of how fragile the foundation of her engagement to Daniel truly is. For Emily, the upcoming wedding is supposed to be a culmination of everything she's dreamed of, a perfect beginning to the rest of her life. But as the tension in her family escalates, her naivety about the people closest to her begins to unravel. She will soon realize that the man she was about to marry is not the person she thought he was, and that her mother's actions would be the most devastating revelation of all. Daniel Roberts, at 26, presents himself as the ideal fiancé. He is outwardly charming, attractive, and ambitious. To anyone who meets him, Daniel appears as the epitome of a young man on the rise, confident, successful, and well-spoken. But behind the facade lies a deeply troubled man, one whose charm masks a darker, more manipulative side. His past has shaped him into someone capable of emotional manipulation, a man who uses his good looks and emotional intelligence to control and dominate the people around him. Daniel's troubled childhood plays a significant role in shaping his approach to relationships. Raised in an abusive household, he learned early on how to manipulate those around him in order to survive emotionally. His relationship with Emily, at first seemingly genuine, is in fact a calculated step in his need for control. While Emily is idealistic about love, Daniel views it as a power dynamic, an opportunity to control someone he believes to be weaker and more vulnerable than he is. Though he proposes to Emily with the appearance of true love, his intentions have always been far less innocent. At first, Daniel's affair with Linda may seem like a mere betrayal of Emily's trust, but it is much more than that. It is a manifestation of Daniel's need to assert control, not just over his fiancée, but over her mother as well. What begins as a physical attraction between him and Linda quickly evolves into something more dangerous, an emotional power struggle that taps into unresolved feelings of resentment, anger, and neediness from his childhood. Daniel is not merely attracted to Linda. He is compelled by a twisted need for domination, for taking something from Emily that is not just hers, but also something that was once her mother's. The affair with Linda is not something Daniel entered into lightly. He had planned it for months, calculating the right time, the right moments to manipulate both women into his grasp. His emotional detachment and capacity for using people for his own benefit make him a dangerous figure in the lives of both Linda and Emily. For Daniel, the relationship with Linda represents not just an affair, it represents the culmination of his need for control and revenge, not just on his past but on anyone who dares to love him. As the affair grows, Daniel's hold over both women deepens. He begins to manipulate Linda in much the same way he does with Emily, using emotional leverage and guilt to control them both. But what neither Linda nor Emily realizes is that Daniel is far more dangerous than either of them could ever imagine. His web of lies and manipulation will eventually spiral out of control, leading to a tragic end. And by the time Emily discovers the truth, it will already be too late. Linda had always prided herself on being a good mother. After her divorce from Greg, she had poured herself into raising Emily, determined to provide the best life she could for her only child. As a result, Linda's personal life had stagnated. The years spent as a wife and mother had buried her own desires and ambitions. By the time Emily was engaged to Daniel Roberts, Linda felt like a shadow of the woman she once was, disconnected, invisible, and emotionally starved. The engagement party was supposed to be a happy occasion. Emily, radiant in her excitement, was surrounded by friends and family, celebrating the union of two people in love. But Linda, standing in the corner, nursing a glass of wine, felt like an outsider in her own home. The years had not been kind to her. Though her daughter's happiness should have been the center of her joy, Linda felt a deep pang of loneliness as she watched the younger generation eagerly embrace their futures. As she stood off to the side, Linda's eyes wandered. She watched Emily laughing with Daniel, their future unfolding in front of her, and suddenly felt an unfamiliar ache deep inside her chest. It was a sense of loss, not just of her marriage but of the person she used to be. It was then that Daniel Roberts noticed her. Daniel, at 26, had the natural ability to command attention wherever he went. He was tall, dark-haired, with an effortlessly polished demeanor, and had always been the life of the party. To Linda, he seemed almost perfect, young, handsome, and charming in the way only someone with a deep understanding of social dynamics could be. Daniel, on the other hand, had been watching Linda from the moment he walked into the room. The two had never spoken before, but there was something about Linda's quiet sadness that intrigued him. He had learned, over the years, to recognize vulnerability in people. And Linda, standing alone, nursing a drink and staring off into the distance, was a textbook example. She was a woman who had clearly lost her sense of self, yet still possessed a quiet elegance that Daniel found irresistible. "Emily's lucky to have a mother like you," Daniel said, his voice warm and inviting as he approached Linda. "You must be so proud." The compliment came out of nowhere, but Linda was caught off guard by it. She had heard similar things before, but there was something in Daniel's tone that made it feel more genuine, more personal. She managed a soft smile, the years of emotional repression lifting slightly in his presence. "Oh, thank you," Linda responded, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She tried to sound nonchalant, but the truth was that Daniel's attention felt like a breath of fresh air. She wasn't used to being seen like this anymore, especially by someone so much younger. For the next few moments, their conversation flowed easily. Daniel spoke about how happy he was to be marrying Emily, and Linda found herself listening intently, drawn in by his enthusiasm. There was something magnetic about him, his charm, his confidence, his ability to make everyone around him feel important. But it wasn't just his outward appearance that captivated Linda, it was the way he listened. He asked about her life, her past, and her struggles. He didn't brush off her words with small talk or polite nods. He genuinely seemed to care. Linda was used to being dismissed. Her marriage to Greg had made her feel like an afterthought for years. But here, in the presence of Daniel, she felt something entirely new. Valued, appreciated, even admired. As their conversation continued, Linda began to feel a shift within herself. The heavy loneliness that had defined her existence for so long began to lift, replaced by a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in years, desire. But it was subtle. So subtle, in fact, that Linda didn't even recognize what was happening at the time. She simply enjoyed the attention, the validation, the feeling that someone still found her interesting. As the evening wore on, Daniel continued to pay special attention to her. A kind word here, a laugh there, all aimed at making Linda feel comfortable, important, like she was the only person in the room who mattered. By the end of the night, Linda found herself thinking about him in a way she hadn't expected. Over the next few weeks, Linda and Daniel's encounters became more frequent. At first, it was just innocent interactions, small conversations at family gatherings and dinners. Emily was busy with wedding planning, and Linda, though somewhat detached from the excitement, still enjoyed being around her daughter and her future son-in-law. But there was something about Daniel that began to linger in her mind. Linda found herself looking forward to these conversations. They started to occur more frequently, and with each encounter, Linda's walls slowly crumbled. Daniel was an expert at reading people, especially those who, like Linda, were emotionally vulnerable. He knew exactly what to say, how to position himself to be seen as a confidant, a person Linda could trust. The more they spoke, the more Daniel was able to manipulate Linda's emotions. "I can't imagine how hard it must be for you," Daniel said during one of their private talks, "to watch your daughter move on with her life. You've given everything to her, and now you're left with nothing but an empty house." Linda had to fight to suppress the tears that threatened to rise. She had spent years suppressing her pain, burying it so deep that she had almost forgotten it was there. But Daniel seemed to know exactly what buttons to press, and every conversation with him felt like he was slowly peeling back the layers of emotional armor she had built over the years. "I never wanted to be alone," Linda admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to fill the emptiness anymore. I don't know who I am without being a mother." Daniel's response was soft but calculated. "I think you're amazing, Linda. I can see so much strength in you. You've done everything for Emily, but what about you? You deserve someone who sees you for who you are." The validation he offered her, the sense of being seen and understood, made Linda feel something deep inside her. The attraction she had brushed off as harmless was growing into something more, something she couldn't control. Daniel was not just giving her attention. He was giving her the feeling of being wanted again, and that was intoxicating. As they spent more time together, Linda's emotional dependence on Daniel deepened. She began to rationalize her growing feelings, convincing herself that it was harmless. After all, Daniel was Emily's fiancé, he was part of the family. It was natural for them to bond, right? And yet, there was an undeniable pull that Linda couldn't resist. She started justifying their private moments, telling herself that nothing was wrong. She told herself that she wasn't hurting anyone. But deep down, Linda knew she was crossing a line. And Daniel, knowing exactly how to exploit Linda's vulnerability, pushed her further. He fed her insecurity, made her believe that he was the only one who truly understood her, the only one who could make her feel alive again. It wasn't long before Linda began to seek out his company more frequently. She began to yearn for his attention, the kind of validation he could provide, the emotional intimacy she had been missing for so long. It wasn't long before the physical attraction Linda had initially felt began to grow. At first, she had brushed it off as nothing more than a fleeting moment of attention. But soon, the lines between emotional connection and physical desire began to blur. Daniel had been patient, careful in his approach, never rushing things. He knew that to gain Linda's trust completely, he had to move slowly, making each step feel natural. One evening, after a quiet dinner where the two of them found themselves alone in the living room, Daniel leaned in closer than ever before. The air between them seemed charged, thick with unspoken tension. Linda's heart began to race. She could feel her breath quicken as Daniel reached out and lightly touched her arm, his fingers grazing her skin. "I've never met anyone quite like you," Daniel said, his voice low and intimate. "You're strong, but you're also so beautiful. You don't even know how much you mean to me, do you?" Linda's pulse surged. She felt a flutter in her stomach, a warmth that spread through her chest. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her as if she was desirable. And that was the moment Linda lost herself. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, tentative, as if testing the waters. But as it deepened, Linda's rational thoughts began to fade. She was overwhelmed by the emotions Daniel had stirred within her. The years of loneliness, the years of feeling invisible, all seemed to evaporate in that one moment. She felt wanted. She felt seen. Daniel's hand slid to her back, pulling her closer, his lips never leaving hers. Linda responded instinctively, caught up in the heady rush of emotions she had been starved for. As the affair progressed, Daniel's manipulation of Linda grew more sophisticated. He knew how to feed her insecurities and desires, pushing her further into emotional dependence on him. Each encounter became more intimate, more intense, and Linda found herself craving his presence. She began to feel as though she couldn't live without him, even though the guilt gnawed at her constantly. Daniel expertly played on her weaknesses. When Linda would express doubt or hesitation, he would reassure her that their connection was special, that it was something deep and meaningful. He made her feel as though their affair was the only thing keeping her alive, the only thing that made her feel important. And Linda, desperate for love and affection, began to believe him. She justified their actions by telling herself it was harmless. After all, Emily would never suspect anything. She trusted Daniel, loved him. Linda, too, had convinced herself that she wasn't doing anything wrong. She told herself that it was just a passing phase, something that would eventually fade. But deep down, Linda knew she was trapped. And yet, with each passing day, Daniel's hold on her grew stronger. He had her exactly where he wanted her, emotionally dependent and completely under his control. Emily began to notice small changes in her mother's behavior. Linda seemed more distracted lately, her moods fluctuating more than usual. Sometimes she seemed withdrawn, lost in thought, while other times she appeared unnervingly cheerful. Emily attributed it to the stress of wedding planning and the strain of her recent separation from Greg. But what she didn't see was Daniel's role in these changes. Emily had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong between her mother and Fiancé. She trusted both of them completely, unaware that a web of lies and manipulation was slowly entangling her. She saw her mother's occasional silences as nothing more than the lingering effects of a difficult divorce. And Daniel, ever the charming fiancé, was able to keep up the façade of the perfect man, loving, attentive, and devoted to Emily. Linda's betrayal was hidden in plain sight. For weeks, Emily had been noticing subtle changes in her mother's behavior. At first, it was small, insignificant things, moments of quiet that seemed to linger a little too long. The brief flicker of discomfort when she walked into a room and saw Daniel and Linda talking privately. There was nothing overtly alarming, but something about it didn't sit right with Emily. Linda had always been open with her, their mother-daughter bond forged over years of trust and understanding. But recently, Linda seemed more withdrawn, emotionally distant in a way that Emily had never seen before. The once constant source of advice and affection that Linda had always provided was slipping away, replaced by an unfamiliar coldness. Linda had stopped telling Emily about her days, about the simple things that used to be a routine part of their conversations. Where Emily had once confided in her mother about her wedding plans, now she was met with vague responses or, at best, a distracted smile. And then, there were the phone calls. Emily wasn't one to snoop, but the odd, secretive nature of Linda's phone conversations raised questions. When she would enter the room, Linda would abruptly end a call or quickly stash her phone out of sight. There was no reason for Emily to feel suspicious. After all, her mother was just trying to find herself again after the divorce, but a feeling of unease began to fester inside her. Was her mother avoiding her? Was Linda growing tired of her? Or was something more sinister happening? Emily tried to dismiss the nagging thoughts. Wedding stress, she reasoned. Wedding planning had always been a whirlwind of emotions for her, and she had been so caught up in the details, the dresses, the venue, the guest list, that she hadn't spent much quality time with her mother. Perhaps Linda was simply overwhelmed by the impending transition in their lives. But deep down, Emily knew better. She had lived with Linda long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. Her mother, typically open and emotionally available, was becoming a stranger in their home. And as the days went by, that gut feeling only deepened. Her suspicions came to a head one night when Emily decided to return home early from a bridal shower. The night had been filled with laughter, gifts, and well wishes, but as Emily drove home, she couldn't shake the odd sense of discomfort that had been building inside her. She hadn't spoken to her mother much during the event, and she was eager to check in on Linda, hoping to catch up on some of the quiet moments they used to share before her engagement had taken over her life. As she pulled into the driveway, Emily noticed that the lights in the living room were dimmed. Her mother was usually a creature of habit. If Linda wasn't in bed, she'd be watching her favorite TV shows or reading, things Emily could hear from the hallway. But tonight, there was an eerie silence. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough for Emily to slip inside without making a sound. It was then that she heard it, the muffled sound of voices coming from the living room. She froze. It wasn't the kind of conversation she expected to hear between her mother and Daniel. The words were indistinguishable at first, but the tone of their voices, low, intimate, almost conspiratorial, sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She pushed the door open ever so slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw next shattered her world. There, on the couch, was Daniel. His hands were on Linda's shoulders, his lips hovering close to her ear, their bodies positioned in a way that made it impossible for Emily to ignore the undeniable intimacy of the moment. Her mother's back was slightly turned, but the way Daniel's fingers traced her skin, the way Linda leaned into his touch, left no room for doubt. In that instant, time seemed to freeze. Emily's mind screamed at her to look away, to deny the reality unfolding before her. But she couldn't. The shock and horror surged through her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a casual touch, a friendly gesture. It was something deeper, something more. Her mother and her fiancé, were involved in a secret affair. She didn't know how long she stood there, paralyzed by the pain and betrayal. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling. Every inch of her body screamed for her to run, to flee from this nightmare. But she was rooted to the spot, her eyes glued to the scene before her. The tears began to well up in her eyes, hot and fast, blurring her vision. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Finally, her legs gave way, and she stepped backward, her foot making a loud thud against the floor. The sound echoed in the room, shattering the silence and snapping Linda and Daniel out of their trance. They turned toward her in unison, their faces pale with shock. Emily, Linda's voice was barely a whisper, her face a mixture of guilt and shame. But Emily didn't hear it. She didn't hear anything except the deafening roar in her ears, the betrayal that crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her mother, her own mother, had crossed the most unforgivable line imaginable. The pain twisted her insides into a knot. How could you? Emily's voice cracked as the words tumbled out. She was shaking now, her body trembling from the weight of the revelation. The anger that had been simmering inside her suddenly erupted in a torrent of emotion. How could you do this to me? To us? Linda stood up, her hands outstretched in a futile attempt to calm her daughter. Emily, please, it's not what you think. Let me explain. Explain. Emily choked out. How could you explain this? You're my mother. And he's my fiancé. How long has this been going on? How could you betray me like this? Linda opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She could see the devastation in Emily's eyes, the raw pain that she had caused, but there was no way to take it back. No way to undo what had been done. Daniel, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His face was stoic, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt. He seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, but rather than stepping back or offering any sort of apology, he took a different route, one that would further fuel the conflict. Emily, I didn't mean for this to happen, Daniel said, his voice calm and measured, almost rehearsed. I never wanted to hurt you, but you have to understand, your mother and I, we have a connection. We've been through so much together. I tried to make things work with you, but we were growing apart. Emily stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The audacity of his words, his attempt to shift the blame onto her, made her blood boil. So now it's my fault, she spat, her voice trembling with fury. You've been cheating on me with my mother, and somehow it's my fault. Linda's face flushed with shame, but Daniel, ever the manipulator, took another step forward, positioning himself between them. No, Emily. It's not your fault, he said, turning his gaze to Linda, as if signaling her to stay calm. But you have to understand. Your mother is just trying to feel alive again. She's been through so much, and I wanted to help her. We've been having problems for months. You were so busy planning your wedding, so caught up in your own world, that you didn't notice how distant we'd become. Emily's head spun. The audacity of him, the way he twisted the situation to make her feel responsible. It was infuriating. She turned to her mother, searching her face for any sign of remorse, but what she saw only deepened the hurt. Linda was standing there, looking lost, as if caught between guilt and justification. I didn't mean for this to happen, Emily, Linda said, her voice pleading. But there was no emotion in her tone, no sense of accountability. I was lonely. I needed someone. I didn't want to hurt you, but it was too late for excuses. Emily's heart was already shattered, her trust broken beyond repair. The woman who had been her greatest source of love and support had become a stranger. The man who was supposed to be her partner, her protector, had turned out to be the one who had torn everything apart. I can't do this, Emily whispered, her voice shaking with both sorrow and rage. I can't look at either of you. You both betrayed me. You both ruined everything. With that, Emily turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy with the weight of the betrayal. She didn't know where she was going, or how she was supposed to heal from this. All she knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed were filled with silence. Linda tried to reach out, to apologize, but Emily wouldn't answer her calls. The few messages Linda sent were met with nothing but cold indifference. Finally, Emily agreed to meet her mother in a quiet cafe, though she was far from ready to forgive. The tension in the air was palpable as Linda sat down across from her daughter, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. I don't know what to say, Emily, Linda began, her voice faltering. I know. The days following Emily's discovery of the affair between her mother and Daniel felt like a dark spiral for Linda. The weight of her actions pressed down on her in ways she had never imagined. She had seen Emily's betrayal, her tear-filled eyes, her disbelief, and it had torn through her like a knife. Yet it was she, Linda, who had set this all into motion. The once familiar and comforting walls of her house felt suffocating now, as if they were closing in on her. Every room seemed to echo with the sounds of her guilt and the irreversible damage she had caused. At 50, Linda was already battling a growing sense of invisibility in the world. Divorce had left her feeling aged, unimportant, and emotionally adrift. Her marriage had collapsed 5 years ago, and with it, so had her sense of stability. The loneliness was something she had grown used to, but now, with Emily and Daniel in her life, there had been a brief flicker of hope. For a short while, Linda had felt seen again, desired, and needed, first by Daniel, and later by the intoxicating connection that developed between them. But that fleeting comfort was now slipping away. It wasn't just Emily's discovery that was tormenting Linda. It was the reality of what was happening to her. As she sat alone at the kitchen table, the haunting weight of the situation settled deeper into her bones. She had lost everything. She had lost her daughter's trust. She had lost the future she thought she had with Daniel. And now, she feared that the isolation she had once feared so much would consume her entirely. Linda tried to reach out to Daniel, but he was different now. His previously charming and reassuring demeanor had hardened into something darker. He no longer acted like the man who had made her feel special. Instead, he was threatening, cold, and manipulative. Every attempt Linda made to sever their connection was met with resistance. Daniel was not willing to let her go. He made it clear that if she left him, he would destroy everything she held dear, everything she had left. His words gnawed at her, repeating in her head like a cruel mantra. She had believed, naively, that she could walk away from him. But now, as she sat in her home, the pain of losing both Emily and Daniel overwhelmed her. She was terrified of being alone again. The thought of facing life without either of them felt unbearable. Her emotional state became more unstable with each passing day. At night, Linda lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the guilt, the fear, and the loneliness that enveloped her. She was desperate to feel anything other than the hollow emptiness that had settled within her chest. There were times when she felt like she was losing her grip on reality, as if the very fabric of her life was unraveling before her eyes. Every conversation with Emily ended in hurt, anger, or silence. Every interaction with Daniel felt like a battle for control, and with each argument, the emotional toll became heavier. Linda's attempts to justify her affair to herself were futile. She tried to tell herself that she was simply seeking love and affection, something she hadn't felt in years. But deep down, she knew she had betrayed her own flesh and blood. She had destroyed the relationship with her daughter, the one bond she had left, all for a brief fling with a man who had no real affection for her. Her world had become a whirlpool of confusion, guilt, and self-loathing. She could not escape the emotional gravity of her actions. Her relationship with Daniel was toxic, but she couldn't seem to break free from him. He had created a web of emotional manipulation, and she had become entangled in it. One night, Linda received a call from Emily. It had been days since they had spoken. Emily had refused to even acknowledge her mother after the affair was revealed. Linda knew that Emily's anger was justified, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. When she picked up the phone, Emily's voice was cold, devoid of any warmth. "Mom, I want you to stay away from Daniel. I can't see you right now. I don't know if I ever will." The words stung like a slap in the face, and Linda recoiled. For a brief moment, she wanted to plead with Emily, to beg her to understand. But there was nothing to say. Emily was right to be angry. Linda had ruined everything. "I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't mean for this to happen." Linda's voice trembled, but there was no response. Emily had already hung up. That was the moment Linda's mental state began to crack. She had lost her daughter completely, and she feared she would never get her back. It wasn't just the affair that had destroyed their bond. It was the lies, the secrecy, and the manipulation she had allowed herself to fall into. Linda could no longer deny the truth. She had chosen Daniel over Emily, and now she was paying the price. The weight of the conversation lingered in Linda's mind long after the phone call ended. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear to her that she had no other option. If she was going to fix this, if there was any hope of saving herself, it was now or never. She had to fix things with Emily. She had to convince her daughter to understand, to forgive her. But that would require one final confrontation. Linda knew it wouldn't be easy. The emotional tension that had built up between them was at a boiling point. Emily was no longer the sweet, trusting daughter she once was. She was a woman hurt by the actions of her mother, and Linda could sense the finality in her daughter's voice. But Linda had convinced herself that she could still make things right. She didn't care what it took. She would talk to Emily. She would beg for her forgiveness. And if Emily refused to listen, if Emily demanded she leave Daniel for good, Linda was prepared to do whatever it took to make her daughter understand. The night of the confrontation, Linda's nerves were stretched tight. The entire evening felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The house was silent as Linda paced the living room, her thoughts racing. Every possible outcome ran through her head, and none of them felt good. She had no idea what Emily would say, but Linda had convinced herself that she had to go through with it. When Emily finally arrived at the house, Linda could see the anger and hurt in her daughter's eyes. There was no longer any pretense between them. The bond they had once shared was fractured beyond repair. Emily stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Mom, I don't want to hear your excuses. You've broken my heart. You've ruined everything." Linda's heart sank. She wanted to reach out to her, to explain herself, to make her understand. But Emily's words pierced through her, and all Linda could feel was a rising wave of frustration and panic. "You don't understand," Linda pleaded, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you. I was lonely. I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing." Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't get it, do you? You've destroyed everything. I can't even look at you right now." The words cut deeper than any knife. Linda felt as if her entire existence was crumbling before her. In that moment, something inside her snapped. The pain, the guilt, the desperation. It all became too much to bear. Before she knew what was happening, Linda found herself lashing out. The anger that had been building up for weeks, months, erupted violently. She grabbed the nearest object, an old vase from the mantel, and threw it across the room, hitting Emily in the chest. But it wasn't enough. Linda's anger had taken on a life of its own, and she wasn't in control anymore. In a frenzy, Linda lunged at Emily, her hands grabbing for anything she could hold on to. Emily screamed, but Linda didn't hear it. The world around her became a blur of rage and confusion. She was beyond reasoning, beyond the person she had been just hours ago. She was a woman consumed by her own destructive emotions. The violent struggle escalated quickly. Emily fought back, but she was no match for Linda's overwhelming emotional fury. Linda's hands were around her daughter's throat before she even realized it. The room was filled with the sound of gasping breaths and muffled cries. Linda's own heart was pounding in her chest, but the anger wouldn't subside. She pressed harder, feeling the life slip away from Emily, and still, she could not stop. The seconds stretched into an eternity. And then, in a final, crushing moment, Emily went limp. Her body went still beneath Linda's hands. The morning after the horrific events unfolded in Linda's home, the scene remained eerily still. The air, heavy with the tragic aftermath, was filled with the lingering scent of desperation and finality. Emily's lifeless body lay in the center of the living room, a gruesome testament to the unthinkable violence that had taken place within those walls. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Linda, still in a state of shock, was nowhere to be found. She had fled the scene in a state of disarray, a mind shattered by guilt and confusion. She didn't know where she was headed or what she would do next. All she could feel was the crushing weight of her actions. It wasn't until hours later that the first person arrived at the house, Carol, Emily's best friend. Carol had been trying to reach Emily all morning, having not heard from her since the previous evening. The tension that had been building for days had started to take its toll on their friendship, and Carol had tried to contact her repeatedly, only to be met with silence. Worry began to settle into her chest. Emily was always good about answering, especially during times of crisis. But this morning, there was no response, no reassurance. Her heart began to race as she made her way to the house, her footsteps quickening with every step. When Carol arrived, she noticed the front door was ajar. She called out for Emily, but there was no reply. Her instinct told her that something was wrong, and as she stepped further inside, her gaze fell upon the blood-stained floor of the living room. A choking sob left her throat as she rushed forward, her hands trembling as they reached for Emily's still form. The sight before her was incomprehensible. Carol dropped to her knees beside Emily's body, feeling her own chest constrict with sorrow and disbelief. Her best friend, the vibrant young woman who had always been full of life, was gone. Carol's heart broke, and the world around her seemed to collapse in an instant. Tears blurred her vision, and the crushing realization of the tragedy set in. Carol stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice, barely a whisper, was filled with panic as she explained the scene she had discovered. The operator's voice was calm and steady, but Carol could hardly process the words. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her ears. The police arrived shortly after Carol made the call. Officers swarmed the house, their presence disrupting the stillness of the scene. They immediately sealed off the area, carefully observing every detail as they began their work. A quiet tension hung in the air as officers moved methodically through the house, their thoughts focused solely on the task at hand. The living room, where the murder had occurred, was now a crime scene, a place where a daughter's life had been taken in cold blood. The detectives began questioning Carol, trying to piece together the events leading up to Emily's death. Her account confirmed that Emily had been estranged from Linda for some time, their relationship strained by the discovery of the affair. But beyond that, Carol could offer little information that could explain the brutal murder. Emily had never shown signs of being in danger. She was planning her wedding, looking forward to a life with Daniel. Her life, at least in Carol's eyes, seemed full of promise. As the investigation unfolded, the focus turned toward Linda. It was clear that Emily's death wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. The police began to piece together the timeline of events, speaking with neighbors, family members, and friends. Linda's whereabouts were the first to be scrutinized. She had not been at the house when Carol found Emily's body, and there was no sign of her in the immediate vicinity. The investigators knew that Linda, as Emily's mother, was the most likely suspect in this case. But the question remained: what could have driven her to kill her own daughter? The police also began to investigate Linda's troubled relationship with Daniel. At first, Daniel appeared to be a peripheral figure in the investigation, but as the detectives dug deeper, it quickly became clear that his connection to both women was far more complicated and toxic than anyone had imagined. The detectives learned quickly that Daniel had been involved in a secret affair with Linda, something that had begun months before the tragic discovery. Emily, so caught up in the excitement of her upcoming wedding, had never suspected the man she was about to marry was carrying on a relationship with her own mother. But once the affair was revealed, the tragic puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Through interviews with friends and acquaintances, the investigators learned that Daniel had been emotionally manipulative. Linda, despite her reservations, had been drawn into his web. He knew how to exploit her vulnerabilities, appealing to her need for validation and affection. In return, Linda had provided him with a sense of control. But as time passed, the relationship between the two women grew increasingly strained. Emily's suspicions about her mother's odd behavior were mounting, but she couldn't bring herself to believe the worst. The detectives spoke with several family members and friends of Linda, trying to understand the dynamics at play. They discovered that Linda had become more reclusive in the weeks leading up to the murder, often isolating herself from those around her. She would avoid social gatherings, and when she did attend, she seemed distant, distracted, and emotionally fragile. One friend even remarked that Linda's behavior had become erratic, her mood swinging from depressive to manic, especially after confrontations with Emily. As the investigation progressed, the police gathered forensic evidence that confirmed the initial suspicions. Linda's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, a vase that had been shattered during the altercation. There was also DNA evidence that linked her directly to the crime scene, further corroborating the theory that she had been the one to take Emily's life. Yet the question still lingered. Why? What had driven a mother to murder her own daughter in such a violent and personal way? The detectives soon realized that while Linda was the one who had physically committed the crime, Daniel played a crucial role in setting the stage for this tragedy. His manipulation of Linda was no longer in question. In fact, Daniel had been a consistent presence in Linda's life in the months leading up to the murder, encouraging her to distance herself from Emily and fueling her emotional instability. The detectives uncovered several text messages and phone records that confirmed Linda and Daniel had been in constant communication during the period of increasing tension between Linda and Emily. Daniel's ability to manipulate both women, one through affection, the other through coercion, painted a disturbing picture. His hold over Linda was especially evident. She had grown dependent on him emotionally, and when she found herself at odds with her daughter, Daniel's influence became even more pronounced. He had become the only source of comfort for Linda, the only person she felt she could turn to. But his comforting words were laced with control and manipulation. He made Linda believe that Emily was the one standing in the way of their happiness, even though it was Daniel himself who had sown the seeds of division between mother and daughter. Though the detectives found plenty of evidence suggesting that Daniel had played a significant role in shaping Linda's actions, he denied any involvement in the murder itself. His response was cold and calculated, attempting to distance himself from the crime in every way possible. Despite the mounting evidence, Daniel continued to deny any direct participation in the murder, instead portraying himself as the victim of Linda's obsession. He claimed that he had tried to end the affair but that Linda had become unstable, refusing to accept the breakup. The investigation was far from over. As more details came to light, it was clear that Linda was not the only one to blame. Daniel's manipulation and deceit had created a volatile situation, and while he may not have physically killed Emily, he had contributed to the emotional landscape that had ultimately led to the tragic and violent confrontation. The detectives knew they were dealing with two highly disturbed individuals, and the path to uncovering the full truth was just beginning. The case would go on to become one of the most shocking and talked-about tragedies in the area. The small community of Palo Alto, once idyllic and peaceful, was now rocked by the brutal murder of a young woman at the hands of her own mother. Linda's mental state was deteriorating, and she was soon arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Daniel, though not directly involved in the killing, would be investigated for his role in emotionally manipulating both women. In the months that followed, the community struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Neighbors and friends of the Bates and Lewis families couldn't believe that someone so close, someone they had known for years, could commit such a horrific act. Linda's once promising future was now a nightmare of consequences, and the brutal act she had committed would forever haunt her and everyone involved. The investigation into the full extent of Daniel's manipulation would continue, as the police worked to untangle the complex web of lies, deceit, and emotional abuse that had played such a significant role in this tragedy. The pain of Emily's death would linger in the hearts of those who knew her, and the scars of this unimaginable betrayal would shape the lives of everyone connected to the case forever. The trial of Linda Lewis for the murder of her daughter, Emily Bates, captivated the nation. What had initially seemed like a tragic family dispute became a high-profile case of betrayal, manipulation, and shocking violence. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the world watched with bated breath, and the community of Palo Alto was forced to confront the unthinkable actions of one of their own. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Griffin, built a strong case against Linda. They presented a chilling narrative, piecing together the emotional and physical toll that Linda's affair with Daniel Roberts had exacted on both mother and daughter. Evidence of the affair, text messages, phone records, and even testimony from friends and family members, painted a disturbing picture of emotional manipulation, isolation, and control. The prosecution argued that Linda's obsessive relationship with Daniel had pushed her to a breaking point. Their affair, which had begun under the guise of a harmless fling, had consumed Linda's life and driven a wedge between her and Emily. It was clear that Linda had become dependent on Daniel, and that her growing desperation to maintain his affection and avoid losing him was what ultimately led to the violent confrontation with Emily. The prosecution's expert witnesses, including psychologists, testified that Linda's actions were the result of deep emotional instability, exacerbated by years of unresolved personal issues. One of the most damning pieces of evidence presented during the trial was the forensic analysis of the crime scene. The broken vase used to kill Emily, the blood spatter patterns, and the DNA evidence linking Linda to the murder weapon were all crucial in establishing her role in the crime. The prosecution also brought forward the chilling testimony of Carol, Emily's best friend, who described finding Emily's body and the shock and horror that followed. Carol's testimony made it clear that the act was not just a moment of passion. It was a brutal, calculated crime driven by Linda's unraveling psyche. As the trial progressed, Linda sat quietly in the courtroom, her face a mask of emptiness and confusion. She seemed lost, her eyes hollow and distant, as though the reality of what had happened was too overwhelming to fully comprehend. She occasionally whispered to her attorney but offered little in terms of direct communication with the court. Her defense team, led by attorney David Carlson, worked hard to present Linda as a victim of circumstances, an emotionally vulnerable woman who had been manipulated by both Daniel and her own daughter. Carlson argued that Linda's actions, though tragic, were the result of a long-standing pattern of emotional abuse and manipulation. He painted Daniel as the mastermind behind the affair, asserting that he had preyed on Linda's insecurities and used her to further his own needs. The defense contended that Linda was not in her right mind when she killed Emily. The emotional toll of the affair and the rejection from both her daughter and Daniel had pushed Linda to a point where she could no longer distinguish right from wrong. Despite Carlson's impassioned arguments, the evidence against Linda was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. Linda Lewis was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of her daughter, Emily Bates. The jury, though sympathetic to the emotional and psychological toll Linda had endured, could not overlook the brutal nature of the crime. Linda's actions, fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and emotional manipulation, had led her to murder her own flesh and blood. The court found that Linda had acted with premeditation, driven by her desperation to hold on to her relationship with Daniel at any cost. In the sentencing phase, Linda's defense team continued to push for a lesser sentence, citing her emotional instability and her complex psychological history. They argued that Linda's feelings of abandonment and rejection were profound, and that she had been the victim of Daniel's manipulation long before the murder occurred. However, the prosecution countered by emphasizing the violence of Linda's actions and the fact that she had taken her daughter's life in a moment of uncontrollable rage. Judge Susan Keller, who had presided over the case, addressed Linda directly before delivering the sentence. "Linda Lewis, you have shattered the lives of those around you," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "You have not only taken your daughter's life but have irreparably damaged the trust and love that should have existed between a mother and her child. Your actions have left a hole in the hearts of all who knew Emily, and the repercussions of your betrayal will echo through the lives of many." Linda, her face pale and tear-streaked, stood in silence as the judge pronounced the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent as the gravity of the verdict sank in. Linda's fate had been sealed, and there would be no chance for redemption. She had taken everything from her daughter, and now she would spend the rest of her life in a cell, isolated from the world she had once known. As Linda was led away in handcuffs, her eyes blank and unfocused, there was no visible sign of remorse. Whether she understood the full extent of her actions was unclear, but the court had spoken. Linda's tragic journey had ended with a life sentence, a life marked by the brutal murder of her daughter and the irrevocable destruction of everything she had ever loved. For Daniel Roberts, the aftermath of the trial was just beginning. Though he had not been charged with Emily's murder, the revelations about his manipulative and controlling behavior had left a permanent stain on his life. Many people in the community began to question his role in the events leading up to the crime, and rumors spread that Daniel had not been entirely truthful during his testimony. The police continued to investigate his involvement, and though no charges were filed at the time, Daniel found himself ostracized by many. His reputation, once pristine, was forever tarnished by the role he had played in the emotional destruction of two women. As for the community of Palo Alto, the tragedy left a lasting scar. The picturesque suburban town, known for its peaceful streets and idyllic neighborhoods, would forever be marked by the horror that had unfolded behind closed doors. The people who had known Linda, Emily, and Daniel were left to grapple with the reality of what had happened. Friends, neighbors, and family members struggled to make sense of the violence, the manipulation, and the deep emotional wounds that had led to the loss of a bright young woman's life. Emily's death was a painful reminder of the destructive power of manipulation and betrayal. Her memory lived on in the hearts of those who had loved her, but the story of her tragic death was a cautionary tale of how love can be twisted and how emotional vulnerability can be exploited in the most sinister of ways. The trial of Linda Lewis was a culmination of a long, painful journey filled with secrets, lies, and emotional devastation. For Emily Bates, her life was stolen by the very person who should have loved and protected her the most, her mother. For Linda, The consequences of her actions were irreversible. She had taken her daughter's life in a moment of uncontrollable rage, driven by jealousy, manipulation, and a desperate need for affection. As Linda faces life in prison, her case remains a stark reminder of the dangers of emotional abuse, manipulation, and the fragile nature of human relationships. The lives of those involved will never be the same, and the repercussions of this tragedy will be felt for years to come. It is a story of betrayal, loss, and the harrowing cost of obsession, a tale that serves as a chilling reminder of the dark side of human emotions.